We're back to talk about cEDH. It's how you know something went wrong. It's because we're talking about it again. Salt City, their finals game went for 11 hours. Yep. One game of Magic. 11 and a half? That was a lot. Ended in a draw. So, whoops.
Distraction makers.
We're going to talk about three things.
Okay.
We're going to talk about the 11-hour game and the incentives that created it.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about the draw problem, which is like why games are drawing and what maybe should be done about them. And then we're going to talk about the seat disparity win percentage problem. All three of these are connected. So how does an 11-hour game happen? You know, cEDH has sort of grandfathered in a lot of rules and ideas from 1v1 Magic. One of them is that you play a certain number of rounds of Swiss, which means nobody is eliminated from the tournament. You just play against a lot of different opponents. And then based on the points that you accumulate from wins and draws, in this instance, you get placed into a top 16. Once you're in top 16, we go into elimination rounds. The Swiss rounds are timed. Usually it's an hour. I think cEDH might be an hour and a half just because the games are longer. But when you get into the finals rounds, there's no pressure that ultimately says, "Hey, you have to act now," or there's no other opportunity to act. Right? There's never a push in the final rounds to say you must act now.
So this seems to be one of the first criticisms people bring up. Why wasn't there any sort of enforcement of slow play at the tournament? Because in 1v1 Magic, you're playing slowly on purpose to go towards the time.
There's sort of two ways that slow play could be brought up, right? One is that a player says, "Hey, my opponent is slow playing. They're trying to sandbag so that they can draw this out, right, and take it to time." The second way is that a judge can say, "Hey, you guys are taking too long. You need to make a decision." When we look at the incentives of the players in these situations, players, because of the sort of political nature of the game, are incentivized to politic or discuss, debate every action that is taken by every player. And it's not that like they think they're going to move the needle on every single action. It's that the one action that they do gives them an incremental advantage.
Right. So, and this, I feel like this might sound a little bit foreign to people, right? But if you're considering what does it mean if you're just yammering, right? Or if you're just talking to someone, you're politicking, you're trying to confuse someone. At a certain point, it's almost like you're disoriented, you're like confused, you're trying to remember all of the information that maybe you gleaned from your opponents, and that has a major mental impact on all of the players at the table.
Right. So every time that this sort of politicking happens, you're creating a larger and larger mental load for your opponents.
Yeah.
And all of the players are incentivized to do this all the time on every action.
I was going to say, so you wouldn't maybe want to call your opponent on, you probably want to call your opponent on slow play if they're talking maybe on your turn or something like that. But the minute that you have priority on someone else's turn, it probably benefits you to take up as much time as possible debating that action.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. That's sort of the baseline incentive, right? Is that you are incentivized to literally debate every single possible play that's being made. So now let's get to where slow play comes into that. And the issue is that you don't necessarily want to call slow play on your opponent, right? Because you are incentivized to debate this, right? And if you call slow play on them, they'll probably call slow play on you when you go to start debating things. So you sort of end up in this like prisoner's dilemma where nobody wants to call anybody else out about slow play because two things. One, it feels like you're making progress, like you're doing something because you're debating whether or not this thing should happen. And you just keep going around and around and around and around. And like if you start one argument and then somebody else rebuttals it, and the person who did the action agrees with the rebuttal, you're then incentivized to come up with a new argument, which then needs to be rebutted again, and you just do this ad nauseum.
Wow, you said the name of a card that's in this format.
That no one's really playing right now. But
yeah,
anyway.
You could say it's almost like a demonic consultation.
The other half of like when slow play can be called is when judges step in to call slow play.
Right.
And again, this is the problem with this politicking being such a huge part of the game, which we talked about in the previous episode, but it's also tough for judges to interpret what is actually forward progress in politicking versus just stalling.
If someone's saying, I don't want you to do that because if you do that, I'm going to counterspell or I'm going to do this or whatever, like that is essentially a threat that they can discuss and navigate, right? And that decision is impactful, whether that person is or isn't going to do that. Whether they could actually counterspell or not counterspell someone's thing doesn't even matter.
Yeah, which you could say like, okay, show me the counterspell. Or like, I'm not going to believe you, right?
Right.
But then they show you the counterspell.
Sure. Right. And then you still debate. So
yeah.
It makes it difficult for judges to be able to determine whether or not they can or cannot call slow play, right? Because you'd have to force someone saying, hey, you have to take an action. And that action is either playing a card or passing priority, right? But at that point, it could still then go to the next person that could then reinitiate that debate. And that can just continue to go on, basically.
Right. And like these slow play rules were developed for 1v1 Magic, where not taking an action or taking a long time to think about what you're going to do is immensely different than politicking. Like you don't politic in 1v1, right? Like, what are you going to do? You're going to tell somebody, hey, come on, man, don't counter my spell. Like, that's not going to work. They're like, no, I'm going to counter.
You could soft threaten someone and say, like, don't do that or I'm going to use this, but it doesn't matter because that's what someone's expectation already is.
Right. They're like, yeah, they've already sort of assumed that you had the counter spell and went ahead and played their thing anyway. They're like, yeah, go ahead and counter it. Slow play in 1v1 is much easier to spot, is kind of what I'm saying. It's much less up to interpretation as to whether or not this debate is productive or not. We don't necessarily want to get prescriptive about what to do in this instance because ultimately it's going to be up to the tournament organizers and the players to try to like come to a consensus of like, well, this is what we're willing to accept. But we do need some kind of limitation on the ability to politic.
From a designer's perspective, you have to see what do you want players to be doing? What are they doing? And then what then are you able to do to the system to incentivize that certain player behavior? But really all of this starts from identifying a problem. So like from us, we're not going to fix it. Like, so like we can identify the problem. Everyone else is already identifying the problem. We can ask these questions and stuff. There's lots of potential solutions, but those solutions would have to be tested a ton in order to figure out like, okay, what's actually going to work.
I think what's beneficial maybe is to point in a particular direction, right? So we can look at other games. In the previous video, we looked at poker. Poker does not allow players to discuss game actions or show their hands or criticize other people's play. Neither does bridge. Card games, generally speaking, that are more than 1v1 in this way, often have rules that tell you what you're sort of allowed to do and say, right?
Yeah, and I'm sure that there are players that like press against that, right? That push the boundaries of what is allowed or not allowed because it obviously still they're incentivized to do that.
I have heard people talk about like a chess clock type system that like, is sort of a 4-way chess clock. The biggest issue with like trying to implement some kind of a clock system like that is that it incentivizes players to try to run out other people's clocks, right? So if you can only talk when you have your clock running, the issue then is that it kind of falls again back to the priority order problem, which we're going to get to, a little bit later about, the sort of fourth seat losing more often than other times. But if you're in a position where somebody's attempting to win and it falls into that last person in priority orders, it has to kind of fall on that sword, they're also getting their clock eaten up by this.
Right. Priority bullying is already an issue, but what it would end up being is essentially the person in, let's say, seat 1 says, okay, I'm going for the win. Someone in seat 2 is just going to hit their clock right away. Seat 3, they're going to pass, and then seat 4 is just stuck with their whole time trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah.
And like they might end up having to figure that out and politic with everyone else in real time before they then pass to try and bring priority back.
Right. Well, there's also an issue with priority passing on the clock, right? Because if you'd almost need like 2 different clocks, right? Because you have like a politicking clock and then you have a priority clock. Because if you're passing priority, that's different than asking the table about what we can do about a problem. You see what I'm saying? So again, if the clock is running and priority's not changing, your time that's being politicked by other players is happening on your clock. Right? Because if it falls back on you in priority order and you're like, okay, well, it's on me, but I want that time to be passed to other people. Let me pass priority, which is not. It's just saying you need to talk now, which should be using your clock.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Otherwise, somebody else's clock is running and you're talking. And that is incentivizing you to talk as much as possible to run their clock out.
Right.
I don't think a clock really would work at all for that reason.
I think that, I think the biggest issue really is that as long as you are allowing complete open discussion of what's going to happen, players are going to use that to the best of their ability to try and win. And that just means that they're going to try and run out a clock, whether that is a literal clock or whether that's this sort of hypothetical clock that is slow play.
11-hour game clock, right? Yeah. There's a potential solution here that we talked about in the previous video, which is that we have a fork in cEDH, which is that you have... So I was listening to this other great channel called Judging for the Win, and he discussed the difference between regular rules enforcement level events and competitive rules enforcement level events. And the sort of judge's understanding of these events is that one is falling on the side of fun and one is falling on the side of fair. And regular rules enforcement level enforces rules with the idea that everybody's just trying to have a good time, and the competitive falls on the side of we want to make sure that the games are as fair as possible. And I think that's the fork that I'm talking about. The rules level enforcement and the tournament structure is changed. Players that want to politic can politic in that fun environment. We're less concerned with whether the games are fair, which means probably lower prize pools or no prize pools. You can even look at Bridge, right? Bridge uses a point system that you accumulate over time just from playing that has no bearing on any real world currency at all. It's just pride, versus competitive rules level events, which probably need to be no talking. Like, you can't discuss your hand, you can't criticize plays, you can't show your hand. You're just playing the mechanics of the game.
Yeah, it seems like there's this general aversion that players are feeling towards the idea of not being able to talk or politic in the game. It's embedded in the culture of Commander, right? Whether you most people don't start right away with cEDH, they start with EDH and then work their way up. So they start immediately with the concept of politicking in mind, and then it's not like removed as you work upwards. But I do think that like that cultural shift being pushed just by the tournament rules, like people that really end up enjoying playing that format, I don't think some of them might stop playing with the lack of politicking, but I think the majority of the time when that happens and that fork happens, like you're saying, like some people might not go to that competitive point. Not everyone goes from locals into going to Pro Tour or whatever. Maybe they don't enjoy it. But like the people that do are going to have, I think, a more balanced experience.
We're also assuming that there wouldn't be any politicking happening if you're not allowed to talk. Right?
Right.
If you're not allowed to discuss your hand or discuss the gameplay that's happening, you're still allowed to talk.
You can still talk, yeah.
You're just not allowed to talk about your hand. You're not allowed to show your hand. You're not allowed to, right? You're not allowed to criticize play, right? So politicking will still happen. It will just be more subtle and theoretically will not get bogged down in these insane debates that happen for 11 hours. So let's move on to the next problem. So we know that drawing in cEDH has been a problem for a while, and recently there's been some data coming out that suggests that first player wins a much larger percentage of the time than fourth seat. So these two things are pretty well related. I think it's 5 points for a win and 1 point each player for a draw. And the issue with incentivizing players in this way is that you are just incentivizing draws, right? Because the majority of players, it's zero sum if one person wins. If we draw, everybody gets a point.
Right. Basically, the minute that anyone starts going for a win, suddenly... Now, it might be 3 versus 1, which is good because that's, we kind of talk about moving a free-for-all game into like an orthogonal game. And a 3v1 is a little bit more fair of an experience. However, the other 3 players aren't trying to win. They're trying to draw. So they don't need to try and then go over the top, right, or turn the corner and get an advantage. They just need to work together to bring it back to parity, basically.
Yes. So part of the biggest problem with a free-for-all game is this thing that you're talking about, right, where... the dynamics shift in a way that becomes sort of a 3v1.
Yeah.
And there's really no incentive for any of those players to join in with the person who is potentially winning and create a dynamic 2v2.
Right.
So, as I was saying, the sort of seat problem is kind of connected to the draw problem, in that there's a potential that you could create incentive for one of those players to sort of join the winning side in that instance and create a dynamic 2v2 at the table.
And the reason that you'd want to do that is to get one other person to be able to use their resources to try and end the game, right? As opposed to 3 people using their resources to keep the game going. So it's adding one additional opportunity in a sense, to try and bring some finality to it.
Right. And this was part of the advantage to Dockside, honestly, is that Dockside gave that one player a huge boost in resources so that they could go 1v3, right? Dockside was almost indicative of a bigger issue, right? It was covering up this problem because it was allowing someone to get far enough ahead that they could win. But now with him gone, or if other cards had gotten more powerful, we might end up back in the same situation. What we're seeing is that we need a change in incentive, right? And as we said, you potentially want to incentivize a dynamic 2v2 situation so that we have now a player who is incentivized to kingmake, theoretically, but they get points for doing so.
Right. And this still goes back to basically free-for-all games have a lot of these issues like we're talking about, but orthogonal games or games that
have two clear sides.
Two clear sides, right. And that side can be asymmetrical, and so it can be 1 versus 3, but it would be a much different experience if, let's say, someone's going for the win, and if the other 3 players band together and beat that person, then they all win. Like, that would be significantly different than if it were a draw.
Again, this is theoretical. This would need a lot of testing, but sort of a potential idea towards a solution. This would change Commander considerably. So keep that in mind. Take this with a grain of salt. The idea would be that players sort of lose in turn order.
Right.
And then you get more points based on what position you were in when the game ended. So if a player wins the game, then players lose in turn order, meaning the person who's last in priority order would get 3 points. Player 1 is attempting to win. Player 4 is then incentivized to help them win because they get some amount of points for doing so. The other 2 players could get 0 points or some number of points that makes sense for their win percentages in those seats or whatever.
You just don't want to give them too many points, right? You don't want it to be a sliding scale, because if it were, let's say, seat position 1 gets 5 points, then over to 4 gets 3, and then it goes 2 and then 1, the person that might get 2 points is kind of sitting on this in-between, where they might be debating on whether it's worth it or not worth it to participate. And you really want to create this sort of divisiveness, right? Where both parties are decidedly, I do want this or I don't want this. It adds more time, it creates more politicking, takes more consideration. It's a lot easier to just have that hard cutoff of no, you really don't want this person to be winning right now, or you
really do. Yeah. And the reason why you would want to do this in the sort of priority order that we're talking about is that currently there's a problem with the way that priority works in the system, is that if player 1 attempts to win, player 4 is the one who's last in priority order, and currently they're the ones that it falls on to stop the problem, right? So this is potentially adding to this seat win percentage disparity problem where first player, the person who's first player seat ends up winning a much larger percentage of the time than the person who's in fourth, because that dynamic that we're describing makes sense. Player 1 went first, therefore they theoretically get the resources more often to win earlier, and then the problem to stop it falls to player 4.
Right. And so this is kind of a catch-up mechanic, basically, for whoever gets slotted with the fourth seat. Which that's definitely, like you said, it's going to have to be tested. But I think that what we're trying to get at here is that when you end up having this sort of a system that has such this asymmetric disparity of win percentages like this, because this is really bad as far as the win percentage disparity, depending on what seat you're in. There's other ways you could front load it, right? So you could have at the beginning of the game that you get more of an advantage. That's a possibility. And we could talk about that a little bit as well. But the other opportunity is you have this sort of meta tournament structure that is identifying these problems with the system and trying to have things to make up for them.
You also want to do it in a systemic way. You don't necessarily want a metagame to be dictating like the number of points that these seats should get, because the metagame is shifting too often for you to react in real time, creating incentives for players to tune their decks to specific metas to win from specific seat positions, right? So there's another solution that I heard going around, which is that we give more points to players based on the seat in which they win from. So if you win in fourth seat, you get more points than if you win in first seat, because the win percentages are off. And they sort of determined this mathematically, like reverse engineered the win percentages to determine the number of points you should get. It's just like, it's way too tightly wound, right?
Because the minute that starts balancing out, then suddenly you're going to have to adjust those points. And the
minute a card like Dockside shows up, and suddenly you can now win from seat 4 reliably, now you're just Now, Seat 4 has the problem that Seat 1 had, right? You don't want to create a system that does that. You want something that's dynamic, that is based on the player who's attempting to win, not necessarily the seat position itself, because I think you just end up with a ping pong effect. So what are our, I guess, final thoughts here? Let's wrap up some of the suggestions.
Look, it's a rough position to be in. This is a system that was never intended to be designed with this highly competitive format in mind. And I think if so, from the ground up, it would be treated much differently. We're seeing a lot of new games coming out recently that are being treated much differently with this multiplayer format in mind from the beginning. They're still going to have these issues with politicking, with slow play, with all of these things. Like, that's still even going to be something they have to solve, even though they have a system that is better facilitated for free-for-all multiplayer. But really, I think that if there's any sort of potential future for this as a competitive format, it's kind of like you kind of have to just accept what's necessary, right?
I think the thing to keep in mind here most is the incentives that these systems are creating, and the pressure of playing these under a tournament that is being played for a substantial amount of money is really showing the cracks in the system, and that coming up with some kind of a solution for this is going to be necessary. Looking at other systems, looking at other games, determining things like poker, whatever. I think the thing that really starts to rear its ugly head here is that norms aren't rules. There's a lot of norms that happen in regular EDH where players just sort of have accepted okay, well, we have to act in a certain way to make this game work and be fun. When we move into a competitive setting with this pressure of prizes and real money, those norms fade away, and all we're left with is the incentives that the rules create for players.
I would assume that Wizards right now is in a position that they don't want to even attempt to create a tournament like this, because the minute that they formalize a system, they then have to fall on that sword if it ends up not working out.
Now it's Wizards' fault.
So they kind of are relying on these smaller grassroots sort of tournaments to be popping up and figuring out what might work and homogenizing on this understanding probably before they will actually officially support the format.
Yeah.
So it's up to you guys.
Well, and look, there is a bright side here. We've been here before, right? When we look back at original Magic tournaments way back in the 90s, it was wild,
right?
Okay, literally cheating was legal. If you could get away with it, it was legal. That's how they handled cheating in those days, is that it was up to your opponent to catch you cheating, and if they didn't, you got away with it,
right?
So keep in mind that it took a long time to get to where the Magic Pro Tour was. cEDH is not a lost cause. It has its own its own set of problems, but I think players are passionate enough about this game that some kind of a solution will be arrived at eventually.
If you enjoyed listening to us talk about the 11-hour-long cEDH game, please feel free to give us a little like and a subscribe, maybe a comment down below.
If you want to continue the discussion, you can join our Discord. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching. We will see you next time.
Bye. Goodbye.